This is Ari Koretzky, and welcome to Jews You Should Know, introducing the broader community to interesting and inspiring Jewish men and women making a difference in our world. Some are already famous, some not yet so, but each is a Jew you should know.
We are back with another wonderful episode of Jews You Should Know. This week, actually a crossover episode. I had the privilege of being interviewed on a wonderful show called On Principle, which is part of the IDT, Yeshiva of Newark podcast network. And it's actually a podcast network operated by my wife's uncle, a wonderful thinker and podcaster, Rabbi Avreml Kivelevitz. He has an incredible suite of shows that I listen to regularly on all different kinds of topics. And On Principle specifically deals with Jewish education and related topics. And we talked about my assessment of life on college campuses during this terribly tumultuous and challenging time for the Jewish people. So while I have other wonderful episodes of Jews You Should Know natively coming out shortly, meanwhile, I decided to post this crossover of my interview with Rabbi Avreml Kivelevitz on the IDT Podcast Network On Principle show. I hope you'll enjoy and scroll over there to hear many, many more wonderful programs. And now to my conversation on Principle.
Shalom Abraham. I'm here with someone that I think is crucial for all of you to hear from. It is somebody who has his finger on the pulse of what's happening in the campuses of North America today. The campuses where we are seeing an eruption of anti-Semitism that is perhaps unprecedented. And because of my own perplexity, I turned to my nephew, Rabbi Ari Koretzky, the head of Maor, Maryland. He is much more than that. He is a leader in campus teaching, learning. People have recognized him throughout the world as someone who has not only been a pace setter in this area, but he's also someone who understands the quick changing environment and is ready to learn and to work together in order to make a difference. So, Rabbi Ari Koretzky, how do you read what's going on here? Tell us if anything is happening in the school that you're so associated with, the University of Maryland, and what can be done by us adults and people that are sending our children to these schools. What should be our reaction?
First of all, great to be here. Back on Principle. And I wish it wasn't under these circumstances. But look, college campuses have been a morass for Jewish students, certainly for Zionist people, for many years. Now, obviously, within that, college campuses, there are probably thousands of college campuses and certainly hundreds of brand name college campuses around the United States. And not all of them are equal in their mendacity, let's say. It seems that, perhaps ironically, perhaps not, that the more prestigious and the more the university and the more, at least the presumptively intelligent students are, the worse it seems to be. And why that is, probably requires some real understanding, but that seems to be the case. Where I work at the University of Maryland, principally, has not been terrible, thank God. Probably a variety of factors. First of all, it's not a campus that is generally as politically, say, explosive as some of these other campuses. Just the nature of the types of students, being a state school and so forth. And there's a very, very large Jewish community and a very active, very proud, strong Jewish community, and a much smaller, Muslim community, Arab community, although they do exist. Of course, there is a Students for Justice in Palestine. There is movements for BDS that crops up every year or two. And so it's certainly not, like a chapter of ZOA at, on campus, but it's much less combustible than some of these other terrible, terrible environments. But I'm following those places closely. My very close, colleagues work there, and I just read about it with a lot of interest. And it's really frightening. We saw this past week, students barricaded in library at Cooper Union, just Shabbos morning, I was walking outside shul and I bumped into a friend of mine whose daughter goes to Cooper Union. And she was one of the 10 or 15 young Jews who were in that library at that time. And he was telling me about how frightened they were. Tulane is a school that I have a lot of feeling for because my father grew up in New Orleans, and my cousin worked there until very recently. I have a lot of family history there, and watching the images from the street right outside Tulane, where Jews were basically assaulted for trying to prevent the Israeli flag from being burned, has made the rounds on social media. So it's quite frightening what's going on.
Can I just add also the sort of tepid responses from the administrators and from the heads of these universities is also quite troubling. It's so weaselly. Instead of the type of strident statements that were made in light of the George Floyd killing and other things, these campus, know-it-alls, the ones who are supposed to run the school, it's embarrassing, the types of responses they're saying. And therefore, it's almost like they are acquiescing and agreeing to the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas voice. Instead of condemning and saying, we are going to uproot this and we're going to bring in the campus police, I think that makes it even doubly troubling. It's one thing to say that there's an infection of the pro-Palestinian Arab culture. It's another thing to say that everybody is happy about it, and that is really what this campus is perhaps meant to ferment. You mentioned that that your school, University of Maryland, which you have done so much for, is not as politically combustible, and there isn't that much. It's not like these other schools. Are you sure that the troublemakers, or let's call them that, or the protesters from these schools, they're all indigenous to the school itself? Or is it possible that there is some sort of other network, that is sending quote unquote students and people into these places just in order to rabble rouse because they happen to be in such a prestigious area?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And obviously urban campuses are going to be more prone to that kind of infiltration, so to speak. At Tulane, for example, it seems that the perpetrators were not even necessarily students, like you're noting. And that's probably happening in some places, but there's no question that college students themselves have been infected to a really troubling degree. I don't know if you saw the clip going around with this professor who's actually Jewish, scandalously. He was UMass and Amherst, I'm pretty sure. And she's arguing with, a pro-Israel student who's trying to, just get her to say Hamas or terrorists, yes or no, yes or no. And she just won't answer the question. She talks about all about context, and, well, if you start the clock at October 7th, you get one perspective. But if you start the clock at a different time, you'll have a different perspective.
Right, which is really basically the same thing that the Secretary General of the UN said originally, that we cannot look at this in a vacuum. And this, of course, is the whole, to use a cinematic term, if you have a long shot, it's much different. From the long shot, it isn't just beheading and raping and burning and destruction. It's really, we have to look at, the root causes. And of course, the root causes go back. And I think this really feeds into something that, I'm very happy that the Wall Street Journal and the Commentary podcast have pointed out, that a book that I really wasn't so familiar with, despite the fact that I thought I had my ear to the ground, Richard Fanon's book of The Wretched of the Earth, which is supposedly a quote-unquote classic, which really advocates and sets out a path for political aggression towards colonizers, political aggression towards those that have put others down, the ones that have taken over another person's country. And what Fanon writes about is how this violence is the only weapon that they have, and they have to relish it and actually take a sense of pride in it, because the violence is really not just the violence against that specific victim, but it's really a strike against the whole colonialist, imperialist crushing of society that we're all guilty of. In other words, even those that are not the original colonialists, the ones that are born in, for example, the second and third generation Afrikaners in South Africa and other places, they're all colonialists. They're all part of it. And that's, as you know, I'm not telling you anything new, but that has been sort of like the justification for these actions, and that is why they are seeing October 7th as part of that. And it's really troubling because that's really behind a lot of these statements, like what you're saying. I'm just wondering, how do we respond to that? I'm sure the people that are in the schools, that your colleagues, are you guys thinking about how to respond? Can response work, or is the campus idea room so saturated with such evil that it's impossible to even speak to them and for our Jewish students to even make a difference and make a dent?
Yeah, I think, look, it's a maddening landscape, just in terms of the objective experience. It's so ahistorical. It's so historically illiterate. It's so ignorant on every level. It's also so counterproductive to these causes. I mean, we all know so clearly, intuitively, what everyone, at least on the, the pro-Israel side has been saying forever, which is that if they lay down their weapons, they'd be peace. If we lay down our weapons, there'd be, no more Israel. So it's so clear that they're eroding their own cause, unless the cause is literally to wipe Israel off the map. And it's not about peace. It's not about statehood, which is quite clearly, it's a genocidal movement. It's not a constructive movement. It's entirely a destructive movement. Look, we're not going to convince or convert those who are dyed in the wool Hamasniks or pro, sympathizers. I mean, it's going to be very, very few and far between that you're going to find a real listening ear. I think it's much more about that large middle. Most students just don't know anything, and they just hear these very, emotionally saturated claims by Palestinians saying, "Oh, babies are being killed, hospitals being bombed," and these are master manipulators, and they're masters of the art of much like the Nazis and much like Stalinists. They're masters of manipulating the emotional tenor of a conversation, so that everything's about body counts, everything's about the strong and the powerful, oppressing the weak and the powerless, and that's a very quickly adopted narrative on campus. It finds a very ripe audience, and so I think with those kinds of students, you need to be able to ask rhetorical questions, strong rhetorical questions, and informationally illuminating kinds of questions. If you're speaking to people in the middle, things like, "Hey, are you aware of how many students how many Jews do you think live in Gaza?" And let them take a guess. How many Jews do you think live in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, right, et cetera, et cetera? Let them think about these things. What do you think it's like to be a gay person in Gaza right now? I've probably seen the memes going around of the queers for Palestine versus queers in Palestine, and the
right.
rather bloody difference. So most people just don't know anything. They just literally don't know any better. They just hear about body counts. Being able to ask just sort of basic questions that an average thinking person who doesn't have skin in the game can actually respond to as a human being. These other people are just, I'm sorry, they've basically surrendered their humanity at this point. Those who are so doctrinaire and so invested in the Palestinian narrative. It's just, there's nothing to talk about with these people. They are supporters and enablers of terrorists. And in my opinion, they're basically, one step, below, in terms of their moral substance. And they're just, they're just about as evil, and you're not going to get through to them.
One of the things that Dennis Prager said to Megyn Kelly a couple of days ago on her podcast was that this is really a piece not just of the BDS or anti-Israel, but he believes it's part of the whole anti-biblical nature of everything on campus. The rejection, of course, of the idea of a binary sexual roles for men and women, the militancy towards everything that ever touches on anything about race, everything about intersectionality. In other words, they have made the Palestinian cause and the casting Israel as the ultimate Lothario as all part of Western culture's racism, inherent racism, the anti hatred of LGBTQ persons, and therefore you have situations like the Queers for Palestine. So even if we are somehow able to get them to disassociate the actual Hamas versus Israel. It's really part of a whole mentality, and that mentality has been for years been cemented, into the bulwark of so many of these universities. It's like you say, it's going to fall on deaf ears.
I'm gonna have to say, I've been telling people lately that I feel like this situation that we've been experiencing is probably the most pronounced expression of gaslighting that I've ever encountered in my life. Essentially, everything on campus and in these sort of broader, concentric circles of campus-like thinking, everything that's said about the conflict essentially is the exact inverse of what the reality is. Right. So we talk about marginalized peoples, and you talk about, they talk about, there has to be nuance, and you have to think with nuance and, context and nuance. Everything that they think about the conflict is the opposite of nuance. In other words, the nuance would say, hey, this particular conflict, while it may ostensibly look like it fits into a certain paradigm that you have of oppressed versus oppressor, actually, if you dig one layer beneath, it's not that at all. Right. It's really the opposite of that. Where's your nuance? You don't have any nuance to be able to disassociate that. You are aligning yourself with fascistic, totalitarian regimes that are fundamentally opposed with every fiber of their being to every shred of liberalism and of liberal thought that you stand for, and yet you are promoting and taking up their mantle. It's like, where's your nuance? Where's your understanding? Where's any ability to think critically? It's a total erasure of any normal, sophisticated thought at all. But again, the gaslighting is so severe that it completely inverts reality. And that's why Jewish students feel like just totally like they're in this kind of this funny room, this warp of where am I? Just reality is completely subverted.
You talk about being able to ask people to think a little bit deeper. All they really need to do is hear what Hamas is saying in Arabic, and to be aware of the Hamas charter. And all these things really don't take much. And yet, if you even begin to mention any of this, the fact that, the tremendous accolades that are afforded to these murderers, what they are saying, how this is the eradication of a people, it's like water off of a duck. It doesn't register at all. And because I think it's, again, they have allowed it to be absorbed into a basic narrative of the oppressed. And therefore, it doesn't really make a difference what you say. And you're right, it's maddening and it's heartbreaking that so many liberal American Jews who are finding themselves on campus, who have been sent there, who have really been, well, let's say even better, Ari, ever since they were probably in second or third grade, their parents have been priming them for this experience in order for them to really make it, to achieve and to be granted, whether it's an Ivy League school or not. This is what they have been waiting for their whole lives. And now when their identity as Jews is now really being shaken to the core. The fact that so many of them, as you say, are saying, let's go for a ceasefire. We condemn the killings on both sides, not realizing that these sort of, liberal statements are really undermining, in so many ways, the cause of justice. I remember when I was a teacher in the Ida Crown High School, which of course you're familiar with, and at that point, which was many years ago, we tried to do something in our high schools to indoctrinate, or at least to provide some sort of balance of where they were going. So I think, again, the Jewish schools, I think it's easy to sort of perhaps give them what they need to fortify them for the college environment. For the kids who've been going to public school, then that's much harder. But maybe we could begin even in those high schools, like I'm talking about, to try to create right now, because eventually they're going to end up in this college environment. This crisis will pass, but sans the Mashiach coming, there's going to be other crises to come. Do you guys think about this, about extending your work into these high schools to get them ready for the college experience?
I mean, extending into high schools would be an entirely other enterprise. I mean, we're talking about thousands of high schools across the country. Like you said, Jewish schools are already going to be much more efficient at doing this. They have the captive audience. They have the kids that are, marinating, so to speak, in the pro-Israel environment. I mean, you talk about just public schools around the country. You have JSUs, so the NCSY public school clubs, and hopefully they're doing that kind of work. Our hands are more than full just dealing with even a fraction of the Jewish community, which is really, I think, our approach in general. Like I said before, we're not going to convert those who are dyed-in-the-wool anti-Zionist or dyed-in-the-wool pro-Palestinian numbskulls, basically. But we can do two things. Number one is we can provide information and resources for those that are in the middle, that want to learn, that want to know. And I think, but most importantly, our most important function is to spread light and spread positive experiences for the Jewish students. They're the ones who need it. They're the ones who want it. They're the ones who can really impact and inspire, particularly at this moment. They're looking for instructive kinds of outlets. They're looking for, spiritually productive things they could do, materially productive ways to get involved. And that's really our number one target and mission. I think sometimes we have to recognize our limitations. It's a little bit humbling. I'm a big believer that mission creep is real. And to the extent that a person tries to solve all the world's problems, you actually don't solve the problems you really can solve. So if I somehow believe myself to be this, messianic figure when it comes to transforming the campus landscape, either locally or nationally, right, then not only will I fail in that mission because I'm literally battling against an entire cultural milieu, I'll also then fail in my primary mission of inspiring the students that I do actually have a chance to uplift and to educate and to empower with resources, with education, and spiritually fortify. So it's really it's not a zero-sum game. It's choosing one side or the other, and by focusing on what we can actually do, ultimately that trickles down and has a broader impact on the campus environment. But most importantly, it builds young people, which then translates into building Jewish families and building generations of educated and confident Jews. And that's ultimately the only real bulwark we have against anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel, at least that I know of, to be effective from where I sit.
Well, again, let me just note to our listeners who aren't familiar that, in the years that you have been involved in campus life in Maryland, there have been hundreds of students who have now are living a much more religious and committed life, and as you said, have produced families.
Thank God we have impacted a lot of people, or helped a lot of people make great choices, of their own volition, which it's always their own choices, to make those choices to increase their affiliation, their observance, their connection. And to me, that's, again, the greatest possible antidote, the greatest possible, manner of battling. And those are the people that are ultimately going to really take up the mantle of, Jewish beliefs and of supporting Israel, again, both spiritually, morally, and often even by moving there or by living there or spending significant amounts of time there and really taking up that cause. Those are the ones that are going to do it. And there's no shortcuts to doing that. The sound bites and debates on the campus quad do only so much, and it's really not that much. Deep, passionate, life-changing work is what brings adherence to the cause and spreads light across the generations.
Yeah, I mean, well said. But unfortunately, since we're dealing with this sort of like this conflagration that is constantly in our faces, it's almost like if we don't do some sort of response, even from where you're sitting, you sort of appear like you're ignoring the major issue of the day. And I'm sure that's putting more of a burden upon you to not just continue the wonderful work you're doing on the grassroots level, but also to have to do something. Of course, you're saying it's not necessarily rearing its head as much, but it definitely might, and it might happen very soon. Kids who are raised as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, kids who believe in the biblical story, even if it includes Jesus and his disciples, I would assume that they are, as they have been, our natural allies, because ultimately, if you do see things from a geopolitical stance, a case can be made that even the first Aliyah of the 1880s were interlopers into a land that they had abandoned and was lived on by another people. The only real, as we say, the case for Eretz Yisrael really has to be tied to the biblical truth that was dealt with in these Torah readings that we've had the last week and now in this coming week, about how essential this land is to our connection to God, and God gives us this land. And therefore, forget about the messianic implications of why the Christians have been so helpful in the past, but their voices are important. Is it possible, that at least even in this period, we can bring in some of our Christian friends to show solidarity, to talk about how Israel is connected to the Jewish people and how we are with you, and that we understand that this is not a question of soil, but this is a question of soul, a question of that this is God's people who are there. Do you think working with them now and having even Jewish kids who are on the fence hear from so many Christians that'll make a difference, or has their voice also been neutralized as sort of like obscurantists?
A really interesting point. I haven't thought a lot about the Christians. I think that could be an interesting angle, because I do think they're probably a lot more open to it. And I would answer that in the context of, I want to just kind of clarify something that, we said right before this, which is that I'm in no way suggesting that we go on business as usual and don't deal with these, with these issues. I would say 90% plus of what we're talking about right now is Israel and the situation, and constantly referring back to it. The question to me is, do we do that in the context of standing outside on the campus, grounds, on the campus green, debating with, Palestinian activists and standing out there with signs? And I realized that ultimately that would really detract from what I could be doing, which is running programs for Jewish students. I'm launching a new Israel fellowship for freshmen starting this week. We're trying to get hundreds of young people educated and inspired. And in turn, that will allow them to go out and impact their classmates, their roommates, their dorm mates, the people on their intramural sports teams more confidently and more efficiently, effectively, to have that impact on those, that large, vast, sort of middle ground of people. So I want to be very clear about that. Whether bringing in Christian groups is a strategy that could be impactful, I think it probably could be. You want to build coalitions. You want to build allyship. I think that's important. There have been statements of support that have come out for Israel, from the president's office. There was a very strong statement that came out recently from the student government at Maryland, which was excellent. Again, and Maryland is very Jewish. So, the immediate past president of the student government is actually an Orthodox Jewish girl. The president of the student government currently is a Catholic girl who came and spoke at our major vigil the night after the attacks. So there's no question that those allyships are important. I just, again, think we need to, keep the main thing, which is that, at the end of the day, we can, like we always say, we can clean up our own, our own soul, our own soil, so to speak, at our own soul, and then work out in concentric circles rather than the opposite way. And again, you also have to know your lane, know your position. I'm not a political activist. When I see things that incense me, I forward it on. I'm friendly just through my work with people, someone who's a federal judge, someone who is one of the, past president of AIPAC. And I forwarded in this story right away, saying, you go do what you can do, because you have to know who can, achieve things in those circles, and then who's better left to singing and dancing and educating students.
Obviously, you have to work within your strengths, and you have to realize, as you say, you can't have aspirations that really undermine your fundamental thrust of everything you're doing. But when information comes to you, pass it on. Do what you can, and think deeply into your social contacts. The younger you are, the more intense probably, and the more interconnected you are. And if you do care deeply about this, okay, maybe you're not the most eloquent person, but pass it on And it's possible that through this interconnectivity, we're going to be able to have the right type of response. Well, let me just tell you two things on the idea of the Christian. One of the things that you and I have discussed is the effectiveness of speakers and people making points to a audience that is basically unable to concentrate. We realize you didn't grow up with an iPhone, but many of the young people who are now starting to go to college really don't have the ability to even listen probably to this whole podcast without probably tuning out to doing 4 or 5 different things. The attention spans are so thin that the sound bites that you mentioned about and just the statements, the proclamations are enough to sort of say, well, this is the way I'm thinking about things. So we have to realize the limitations that are so entrenched in our society, and definitely our students have that as well. But when something has a panache or something different about it, you take note. I think in the same way, when we are able in short bursts to bring in a Christian, to bring in someone who you don't expect, to bring in somebody like that, I think it can be effective. When we hear somebody who's already prejudiced towards a certain mindset, when we hear him, yeah, of course he's going to say that. That's what he's been programmed to say, no matter how brilliant he's saying it. But when we have somebody from the outside who we don't expect, somehow that convinces us even more. And I think
there's nothing a Jew loves more than an endorsement from a goy.
Right, exactly. It's like, can you believe it? And I think that's really, to win the hearts and minds of people, we have to really be inventive in that way. I give a pat on the back to the Israelis who took a couple of weeks to produce what I heard was from a number of different reporters that I read, a 43-minute video compilation of the horror. And even Peggy Noonan, who a week earlier in the Wall Street Journal was all about ceasefiring and all about Israel, don't go in, and others from Reuters and others, when they were confronted with the reality, not just I heard about it and one image, but putting it together in a way that was true and powerful, it really started to turn the tide for many. So we've got to be as savvy as the enemy, and we have to be inventive and thoughtful. And
absolutely, we have to understand all the way that we are battling the world's oldest hatred, the world's oldest bias, and if Jews are constantly frustrated by the lack of impact that our Hasbara efforts often have, and how things seem to fall on deaf ears in many cases. Number one, I think we should be heartened by the examples, if they're rare or not, of successes. You look at what John Kirby, the spokesman, White House spokesperson, said recently. I thought it was unbelievable how strong he came out, and fought back against sort of really ignorant press questioning. And I saw the Czech, UN ambassador, or the Czech prime minister, say we might exit the United Nations, which is an incredible statement of moral clarity over the United Nations, something even Israel doesn't say, over the UN's just total, moral equivalency and equivocation and so forth. So things like that are heartening. A, and B, recognize what we're up against. We are up against the decks. The deck is stacked, mightily against us. It's designed that way. And I think here you need a spiritual, theological lens to understand that there is this, deck stacked against us. The world is programmed or conditioned to be that way. And we have to understand what that means from a theological perspective. We've seen here that the unity and the interconnectivity of the Jewish people is our greatest weapon. And whether we're using that for political advocacy or for sending letters to soldiers or baking cookies or doing anything we possibly can, that really is ultimately our saving grace as a nation. It's what, sadly, I feel, not to ascribe causes, but it certainly was a cancer in our national soul leading up to this horrible cataclysm. And it's the salve that we're all experiencing right now, I hope, and contributing towards. And may that only continue in the weeks and months to come.
Well, again, you sort of gave me a little opening here as in my rabbinical position. So I'll just add the following. Whether it can be genealogically ascertained or not, we know that we are dealing with the children of Ishmael. And it would seem from all the medieval rabbinical commentators that they have all said clearly that the rise of Islam, the power of Islam, it's all really tethered to verses in the Bible, verses in the Torah that indicate who Yishmael was and Yishmael's power and strength. Yodei Bakol, V'yad Kol Boy, Para Adam, all the terms that we had in last week's parsha, and then we'll have later in this week's parsha coming up about Rova Koshes. It all is so starkly clear to us. But as we see the power of Ishmael, the fact that God listens, the fact that that Elohim was Imai, all these things which sort of are in a way an answer to how this is able to happen. That Ishmael has a role, and somehow the struggle between Avraham, Yitzchak, Yishmael, Hagar, Sarah, how it's all really still is so primal. I think one of the things that we need to emphasize is that the power of Yishmael, as Chaim Kivelevitz says, was to pervert the incredible gifts that Avraham Avinu bestowed, that Avraham Avinu asked for, that were maybe even genetically in Yishmael. The fact that he has a way for God to respond. The fact that if he wanted to, he could have been, and he was at the end of his life, but even for the majority of his life, he could have been an incredible beacon of what it means to be a great servant of God. But instead, as Rav Chaim Kivelevitz says, he took those energies in another way and he became monstrous. It was monstrous, despite the fact that God promises that this will be a nation that will spread across the world in tremendous numbers. But if the idea is correct, that we take, as the Kabbalists say, the psolis of Avram is the power of Yishmael, the idea of the loving kindness, the chesed of Avram, that was somehow perverted into this 70 virgins, aggressiveness, creation, take over everything, absorb, then what we can do, I believe, is realize what was been given to us, which is in our DNA, is the great chesed of Avram. And that is what you're saying, the unity. Yes, it's not only an intellectual unity, and now the people that were on the left are saying, yes, let's support, but they have opened up their hearts, their pocketbooks, their minds to do chesed in ways that are off the charts, ways that I think even surpass what has been done in our history. Avram's midah of chesed, this midah of Avram that Yishmael has perverted, we can hold fast to it. Maybe that is what we are seeing. And if we continue in that way, in so many fashions, giving our time, effort, mind, as Rav Yoshev says, giving time is the ultimate chesed in terms of listening, being involved, and coming up with ways to support, then I think we are, as you say, we are indeed fighting Yishmael in the greatest possible way. Ari, thanks so much for giving us this time. You know that we're going to be in touch because, Ari and I aren't just, he isn't just someone I interview, but Ari and I talk frequently about everything that's on both of our platforms. We'll see everybody.
This has been Ari Koretzky on Jews You Should Know. Please visit us at JewsYouShouldKnow.com and subscribe at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume podcasts. Find us on social media at Jews You Should Know. If you'd like to become a supporter of this podcast, we would greatly appreciate that, and you can do so by visiting patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Jews You Should Know. Finally, if you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review so that we can continue to grow and introduce many more people to Jews You Should Know.